Welcome to Middle Eastern History episode 25. We've had 25 of these since I believe it's July or August of last year, and they're all up on the YouTube page. I hope you enjoy them. This episode is the Sultanate of Women. That's what this period is usually called. And for those of you who've been here before, please oblige me as I go through the rules for those who may be less familiar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not qualified in history, religion, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today from an academic perspective. And I am going to try and give this presentation from a secular point of view. So although there will be religious topics discussed, I'm not coming at it from a religious perspective. The other thing is that we're talking about topics that can be a little bit delicate, so let's be respectful of each other. But at the same time, I really like interactivity. I like questions, comments, clarifications. If you want to add something, please press the raise your hand button and I'll unmute you so you can talk. Or otherwise, you can put something in the chat. I do read the chat as we go through the presentation, and I will respond to your questions. Yeah, I want to make this presentation about you guys. And this class will be a 101 and a 201. And what I mean by that is that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. And like all the previous classes, there will be a 2-hour hard stop, which is sort of our agreement that whatever we don't cover in 2 hours, that's okay. It'll just roll into the next episode. We can still have conversations, but we won't advance to any new slides. And finally, this is a recording. So you can watch it later, and you can watch all the previous episodes. They're on YouTube and Zach's website, Omnicarta. So everybody's favorite part, the quiz, to see what you remember from our presentation last time. So question number 1, which of the following were commissioned by Suleiman I and built by Mi'mar Sinan? Choose all that apply. Şehzade Başı Camii, Süleymaniye Camii, Most Mehmet Pasha Sokolovich, Ayasofya Hürrem Sultan Hamamı, Barbaros Hayrettin Pasha Türbesi, Khosrowiye Mosque, and the old city walls of Jerusalem. And G is definitely one of the answers. C is another one. Yep, keep going, guys. B is also a really great answer. Let's keep going. Or is anybody going to guess the theme of this question? Yep. Basically, all of these are these were built by Mi'mar Sinan. All of these were built at the commission of Suleiman. So these are all correct answers. All right. Question number 2. Which of the following best explains why Suleiman is known as Kanuni by Muslims? He created the Ahli Hiraf, the Craftsman Guild, which organized and patronized large numbers of Ottoman craftsmen, allowing for the height of calligraphy and metalwork. He was able to win stunning military victories at Rhodes in 1522, Mohacs in 1526, and Baghdad in 1534, and the title celebrates his military prowess and the embrace of jihad. He was responsible for organizing and standardizing the large number of law codes that existed throughout the Ottoman Empire into one clear legal project. And he was able to increase the Ottoman diplomatic presence around the world, creating alliances with Aceh in Indonesia, France, and Zapoya's Hungarians. And I have C. C is correct. He's called Kanuni because he organized the law codes. He did all the other things, but that I've listed here, but none of those got him that title except for C. All right. Number 3. Which of the following best explains why Ottomans were not able to permanently acquire Morocco and Tunisia during Suleiman I's reign? A, the Portuguese made several city-states along the Atlantic coast of Morocco, which drove a wedge between the Ottomans on one hand and the Saadians and the Hafsids on the other. The rulers of the Saadians and Hafsids sought out Spanish support to overthrow the Ottoman vassal leadership of the Wattasids and Barbarossa, respectively. After the Knights of St. John defeated the Ottoman navy at the Siege of Malta, the Ottoman navy was not able to reach Morocco or Tunisia safely to maintain those lands, or Suleiman devoted much more effort to controlling the Balkans and did not have the troops to spare to move soldiers to North Africa. And in the chat, I have D. D is not the correct answer. And I have a comment. A is also not the correct answer. Um, C is also not the correct answer. So everybody has guessed wrong, I guess. The answer is B. The Saadians and Hafsids worked together with the Spanish Habsburgs to remove the Ottomans, and this sort of throws people as a little bit, because they sort of have this expectation that the Muslims will side with the Muslims and the Christians will side with the Christians. That's not the case in North Africa. What was much more important to these local Muslim rulers was maintaining their independence, and if they could do that through intervening with the Christians against the Ottomans, that was what they did. And I have a comment from Howard. So let me guess, defeating the Habsburgs was more important than defeating the Muslims. It's actually both. The Ottomans wanted to control the Muslim states and turn them into vassals. In terms of the Habsburgs, it was completely defeating them and taking away their territory. All right. Question number 4. Which of the following were Ottoman victories against the Hungarians and Habsburgs? Choose all that apply. The Battle of Belgrade, the Battle of Mohacs, the Siege of Vienna, the Siege of Esztergom, the Siege of Eger, and the Siege of Székelyvedár. A is correct, B is correct, D is correct, and F is correct. F is a little bit tricky. I could see it going either way. Székelyvedár was an Ottoman victory, but Suleiman I died in the siege. Eger was, this siege of Eger in 1552 was, I didn't mention it last time, but from the Hungarian perspective, the siege of Eger of 1552 is one of their crowning patriotic moments, where they were able, with very few soldiers, to actually hold back the Ottoman forces. It was frequently referred to in the 1800s when there was a swell of Hungarian nationalism, and Eger was the symbol of an undefeated Hungary in that sense. And the Siege of Vienna was an Ottoman attempt at victory, but a snowstorm effectively prevented the Ottomans from fully realizing that victory. And even before then, half of their artillery didn't get to Vienna because of the wet, soaked ground, and so the cannons couldn't move forward. But Belgrade, Mohacs, Esztergom, and Székelyvedár were all Ottoman victories. Question number 5. Which 3 of the following statements explain why the Safavids were an ideological threat to the Ottomans? The Safavid embrace of Shiite Islam and Shiite Islamic evangelism to the Turkic tribes of Anatolia created the possibility of Shiite rebellions in Ottoman territory. By having a physical position between the Ottomans and India, it prevented the Ottomans from maintaining important alliances with Indian states like Gujarat. Suleiman I had difficulty proving that he could be a caliph without the genetic pedigree, and failure to defend Sunni Muslims in Persia that would undercut his claim. Ottoman Sufi traditions came from Persian Sufi orders that the Safavids repressed. Persians began creating a version of the Devshirme system with the Georgians and Circassians, threatening the possibility that those border groups would side with Persia. The Safavid legal system was more desirable and more fair than the Ottoman legal system. Any guesses in the chat? I've got A. A is definitely one of the 3 right answers. Let's see if we can find the other 2. C and D, exactly. Great job, everybody. So it's A, C, and D. Those are the 3 right answers. The Ottoman Empire was able to maintain alliances with Gujarat through their naval capabilities, and the Safavids never really prevented that. The creation of the Kurshi, which were the slave soldiers in the Safavid army, from the Georgians and Circassians were never really seen as an ideological threat to the Ottomans, even though they were a physical threat in that they were a military. And the Safavid legal system was certainly not more desirable than the Ottoman legal system. The Ottoman legal system was much more revolutionary, organized, and developed, especially during the time that Suleiman was alive. All right. So we discussed last time aspects of Suleiman's character, but we really didn't touch upon the palace life. And that's something that Suleiman is rather famous for. Topkapi Palace became, during Suleiman's reign, a sort of haven that the sultans would go to and spend a lot of time at, that sultans would begin to spend a lot of time at. And the mother of the sultan, the Valide Sultan, I have a comment here that the fort that the Ottomans had to get through at Sigetvar was a huge part of the reason the Hungarians were able to hold off the Turks for as long as they did. It was largely because the Ottomans outnumbered the Hungarians that they managed to capture Sigetvar. That's absolutely correct. But when we talk about Suleiman, we start having the rise of the internal machinations of Topkapi becoming part of the Sultanate structure. Now, Suleiman himself was powerful enough to contain these, but his mother, Aisha Khatun, who was a princess of Crimea, was definitely one of the individuals who began to wield power at the court. And we're not going to speak about all of these women, but I wanted to point out these are typically the 9 women who are thought of, especially the last 7, when we talk about the Sultanate of Women. And because there's some overlap between what we didn't do last time and the Sultanate of Women, I've sort of put it together. You can see Aisha Khatun in the upper left-hand side again. That's Suleiman's mother. And you can see Hürrem Sultan. We haven't talked about her yet, who is Suleiman's wife, and a number of these other women. Now, one of the things that we should note about all of these women is that none of them are Turkish. When it says that Mihrimah was Turkish there, what I mean by that only is that she's Suleiman's son, and so she took his Suleiman's daughter, sorry, and so she took his nationality. But you can see also by their complexion that they are European. And you can also see from the nationalities on the right-hand side, with the exception of Mihrimah, right, who was herself born a princess, all of these were born outside of the Ottoman Empire, or if they were born within the Ottoman Empire, they were born to non-Muslim subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And they were kidnapped either directly by force or part of the devshirme system, and they were sent to the harem because of being as beautiful as they were. And through their position in the harem, they were able to achieve political power, either as a Valide Sultan or as a Haseki Sultan. And I've used these terms, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what they mean. But you can see here the incredible variety of European women that end up in the court of the Sultans. So when we talk about the Valide Sultan or the Haseki Sultan, sorry. Yeah, okay. We're talking about the Valide Sultan is the mother of the Sultan, and the Haseki Sultan is the wife of the Sultan. And they had both of them had a number of duties, especially the Valide Sultan. Her role as the mother resulted in her giving petitioners access to the Sultan. They were respected for their piety, and they often gave charitably. There's, for example, one of the major mosques in Istanbul. There are a number of them, but one of the major mosques is a mosque given in honor of Mihrimah from all that she donated in order to have that mosque built. And so we move to probably, the first Haseki Sultan. Again, the Haseki Sultan is the title given to the chief consort of the Sultan. And it's important to explain how revolutionary this is. Within the Ottoman Empire, up to this point, what ended up happening is that the Sultan would have many consorts. These consorts as soon as they bore the child to the current governing sultan, they would be sent with their son to one. If it was a daughter, it wasn't counted. They would be sent with their son to one of the major cities of the empire, like Manisa or Amasya or Trabzon, and they would become effectively the governors of those regions. Now, of course, the children would be of the age of minority, and so they couldn't rule in their own name, but they could. But the Valide Sultan, the Valide, the mother, could rule in the name of that future prince, that Valide Shehzade, right, the mother of the prince. Um, we saw that, for example, when we talked about Selim growing up in Trabzon, Selim the first growing up in Trabzon, and his mother, Aisha Gulbahar, was raising him there. She was a consort of Bayezid II. And so when she gave birth to Selim, he was sent to Trabzon. And this was the way it was done. With the creation of the Haseki Sultan, this woman was able to charm her way into actually becoming Suleiman's wife and primary consort, who would live with him and effectively become a queen. Now, I have a comment that at least the Turks returned the favor to all the women they enslaved by giving them positions of political power within the Ottoman Empire. I don't think that's entirely accurate. Most of the women in the harem, the overwhelming majority of the women in the harem, had no political power at all. There are some situations that we're going to talk about where women in the harem were killed by other women in the harem for political reasons. So the women that we're talking about today are those who were the most beautiful, intelligent, cunning, and able, because they were able to move through this system in order to achieve power. In terms, I have another question about the baby girls. The baby girls just became princesses. They didn't have the right to rule in the Ottoman Empire. It was very strictly a male-based governance system. So the princesses would have access to a certain amount of daily stipend, and they would spend that doing all kinds of, quote, princess things, like opening up hospitals and schools, going out with the people, but they were not allowed to have any voice in governance. Of course, how strongly that's enforced really depends on who they marry and how much power and pull those men have, or who they father, and how much power those men have. And through that, these women can exercise political power. So getting back to Hürrem Sultan, we don't know her original birth name. The most common suggested birth name is Alexandra Lisovska, or Anastasia Lisovska. She was most likely the Ruthenian from the city of Rohatyn in modern-day Ukraine. You can see it on the map there. She was taken as a small child and brought into the court of the Sultan. I have a question. So were women only valued for their sex appeal then? I would say no. Sex appeal was certainly the door in, but once you're in the harem, there are a lot of incredibly attractive women. What made a lot of these women stand out was actually how intelligent they were. We're going to talk about Nurbanu Sultan, who's very well known for being intelligent. Hürrem Sultan spoke at least 3 different languages. These are not these were not irrelevant people. And as for the princesses, if the princesses were ugly, I mean, the princesses are not in the harem, right? We have to sort of differentiate that. The women who are coming from the harem are becoming either the consorts or the primary consort, right? The primary consort being the Haseki Sultan. So, and since Ottoman power is passed down the male line, there is no Ottoman queen that can rule in her own right, like say Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth in England, right? You don't have that in the Ottoman Empire. So the only way that a woman could give birth to a ruler of the empire is if she's a consort of the current sultan, right? So the princesses just did princess things. I don't know how to say it better than that. If they were ugly, it didn't really matter because they would just be married off to either an important general or a grand vizier or a governor or somebody else to facilitate a political tie. All right. So now Hürrem Sultan was originally living in what's called the Eski Saray, the Old Palace, and that's where most of the harem was located throughout the reigns of the previous sultans, right? During the reign of Sultan Selim, Sultan Bayezid II, Mehmet the Conqueror, all of these had built in Constantinople this old palace before the creation of Topkapi, and that is where the harem was originally located. There began to be a shift under Hürrem Sultan to move it from the Eski Saray, from the old palace, to Topkapi, which was the actual palace of the Sultan. Now, one of the difficulties of one of the things that's worth pointing out is that Hürrem Sultan is not her name either, right? Hürrem means the happy one in Turkish. And so she was given this name because she was very happy. But as I said, whether her name is Anastasia or Alexandra, and her surname is Lisovska, these are things that have been historical conjectures, but she never used those names. And in most of the cases, the people that we're going to talk about today, like Hürrem Sultan, like Nurbanu, like Safiye and Kösem, these are all names that were given to them. These are not their birth names. There was a question asking if the princesses' marriages are typically arranged. To a certain degree, yes, depending on the political pull of that princess. And then she could sort of choose between different important suitors, but it was not the case that a princess could choose of her own free will who to marry. And of course, the consorts were not choosing the sultan that they slept with. They were assigned a harem belonging to a specific sultan or a certain prince, and that would be the person with whom they would have a consort. Yeah. As you can see on the right-hand side, the relationship between Suleiman and Hürrem Sultan, often called Roxelana, meaning the Ruthenian one, in Western sources, has been a staple of Turkish television and serials from this region. The most recent is, of course, Muhteşem Yüzyıl, being the Magnificent Century, and you can see there the actors who play Hürrem Sultan and Suleiman in their appropriate costume. So while she was in power, as I said, she was doing, princess things. Now, as I said, Haseki Sultan is not a princess. She is a consort, but she is the prime consort. And so she got a stipend that was larger than any other consort by orders of magnitude. And with that money, she financed the Haseki Sultan complex. Mi'mar Sinan built this, like we talked about a number of the other things he built this as well. And the Haseki Sultan complex has a lot of different elements in it, right? It has a Friday mosque, it has an imaret, which is a soup kitchen, it has a madrasa, which is an Islamic school, it also has a mektep, which is a elementary school. It also has a religious bent, but it's more of an elementary school than a place where the Quran is studied, and a Darus Sifa, or a hospital, right? Darus Sifa literally means the house of healing. It's a different word than is used in Arabic, actually, for that term. And because Hürrem Sultan was a native speaker of Slavic languages, she was predisposed to have warm relations with the leadership in Poland. Now, Poland was a historic neutral party, let's say, with regards to the Ottoman Empire, that would eventually shift towards antagonism as we move further and further in the years. But at this point, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a tentative ally of the Ottoman Empire. And so you can see this letter from Hürrem Sultan to King Sigismund Augustus of Poland. It's written in fluent Turkish. Of course, at that time, remember, Ottoman Turkish is written with the Arabic script, but it's written in Turkish, complimenting him on the accession to the throne. And I have a question of, were the women only useful if they could be married off then? If you're talking about the princesses, generally, yes. Um, but they do have influence at court in terms of creating alliances. In terms of actual, but when it came to the women, if they were Valide Sultan or Haseki Sultan, they had a lot of power in terms of creating these kinds of large scale structures. They had power in terms of promoting coups and um, communicating with all of the various elements within the government in the divan. We're going to get to that soon. All right. So the influence of these women in the court machinations begins with Suleiman. And so Suleiman had two consorts that had borne him male children. Because as soon as he made Haseki Sultan his wife, he stopped giving legitimacy to the children born of the other consorts. But his first consort was Mahidevran. And you can see sort of a stylized picture of her on the left-hand side. And from Mahidevran came his firstborn son, Şehzade Mustafa. Now, Mahidevran and Hürrem Sultan, right, were effectively sister wives, if you want to think of it that way. But Mahidevran was not Haseki Sultan, right? She did not get this title of being married. She was just a consort of the Sultan. And so Mustafa had sort of a weird position in the hierarchy, in that he was the eldest son, so he should inherit the Ottoman throne, but he was not the child of the Haseki Sultan, right? The recognized queen. So this created a lot of friction, especially when we look at Hürrem Sultan's position on it and Rustem Pasha's position on it. Rustem Pasha being the Grand Vizier in the middle part of Suleiman's reign. Now, in the 1550s, Suleiman, it came to Suleiman's attention that Mustafa was planning a rebellion, and the allegation that he was fomenting a rebellion was never proven or unproven. There are, and it's still a controversial question to this day. Most people say that he was probably not promoting a rebellion, but regardless, Rustem Pasha especially, and it's believed Hürrem Sultan and Rustem Pasha's wife, Mihrimah Sultan, convinced Sultan Suleiman that Mustafa was betraying him. And so in 1553, Suleiman orders Mustafa to be strangled. You can see that in the picture on the right-hand side of Mustafa being pulled back and strangled while Bayezid looks at him. Interestingly, Mustafa was probably the most capable of Suleiman's sons who would inherit the throne. We have statements, for example, you can see the one below from Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq, who, despite having such a French-sounding name, was actually a Flemish speaker representing the Habsburgs. He was their diplomatic envoy to Constantinople. And he said, Suleiman has among his children a son called Mustafa, marvelously well educated and prudent, and of an age to rule since he is 24 or 25 years old. May God never allow a Barbary of such strength to come near us. And apparently, for Ogier, God interceded. But that was not the only son that Suleiman put to the sword. So later in his reign, Suleiman gets it in his head that his son Bayezid is one of Hürrem Sultan's children. In fact, it's her oldest son that is still alive. Her first son Mehmet was killed in battle. This is her second son Bayezid, and Selim is her third son. Selim decides to lead Bayezid's forces in fighting. Selim decides to lead Suleiman's forces in fighting Bayezid in the city of Konya. We remember Konya from several lessons ago, right? That was that holy city in the southwest of Turkey. And the two armies meet outside You can see this is from Muhtasham Yazil. This is a picture from one of those episodes, and you can see Şehzade Selim. And next to him is the Grand Vizier at that time, which was Sokolu Mehmet Pasha. We're going to speak a little bit more about him soon. And so you can see that Selim had the support of his father in confronting Bayezid at Konya, and Bayezid was defeated. He fled to the Safavid Empire, and he stayed there for 2 years at the court of Shah Tahmasp of the Safavids. And we met him when we did the Safavid Empire, right? While he was in the court of Shah Tahmasp, Suleiman kept asking Shah Tahmasp to return Bayezid to him. And for 2 years, Tahmasp refused, but eventually he did. And Suleiman ordered, as soon as Bayezid came into Ottoman custody, which was near the city of Qazvin in northwestern Iran, that he be garroted. And so you can see what that looks like on the left-hand side. So Suleiman was responsible for murdering 2 of his own children, and it's believed that Hürrem Sultan was responsible in some degree, at least for the killing of Mustafa, if not the killing of both Mustafa and Bayezid. I have a question of, isn't that brutal? And I was going to say, you haven't seen anything yet. So as we mentioned last time, we had the Battle of Sigedvar. As we mentioned earlier today, we had the Battle of Sigedvar, which was a difficult Hungarian fortress to take. And the defense was led by Nicola IV Shubic Zirinsky. This was a Croatian individual who was part of the Hungarian Empire. You can see him sallying from the fortress at Sigedvar. And in this battle, the Ottomans are successful because of the superior numbers, but this charge of Zirinsky's results in Suleiman losing his life. And so that changes a lot of the face of the way the Ottoman Empire is going to be run. So as a result of Suleiman's death, his body is actually hidden. You can see in this sort of miniature on the left-hand side, transporting Suleiman south, that his body is hidden inside this red horse-drawn carriage. And there was even a body double that pretended to be Suleiman until the body could be brought back safely to Constantinople. Once it was there in 1566, there was a funeral and his body was interred at this mausoleum. Now, following Suleiman's death, there is a peace treaty signed, the Treaty of Adrianople, with the Habsburg monarchs that brings peace to that border for about 20 years or so. But there's always internecine squabbles and fights along that border. So by the time that Suleiman dies, all of the territory except that area that's sort of purplish was under Ottoman control. Or in the case of places like Crimea or what's now Romania, those areas are under the control of vassals of the Sultan. So you can see he has an empire that is massive in size, stretching over 3 different continents, and has coastline on about half of the Mediterranean, direct access to the Red Sea. You can see they also expanded into Ethiopia, up to the borders of Ethiopia. And as we mentioned last time, during his wars with Persia, Suleiman brought Baghdad under Ottoman control and signed the Treaty of Amasya, which fixed the border of the Ottoman Empire and Safavid empires. So once Selim II becomes the Sultan, we have a number of processes that have already been established during Suleiman's reign. And while Selim is Sultan, they become more instantiated. The first one is that the Sultan will rarely leave Topkapi or if they leave Topkapi, they're going to another palace and they're going to stay there for a very long period of time. And this is very different from the sultans we've seen, the first 10 sultans in the Ottoman Empire. Almost all of these sultans went to battle. We just talked about how Suleiman was killed in the siege of Sigetvad, but Mehmet II, all the battles he fought, he was on the field, or he tried to be on the field for as many of them as he could be, right? The same with even the founder Osman, right? He was there at the Battle of Bofas. So this was a fundamentally different behavior where the Sultan would just stay in the palace, he would eat, he would drink, despite Islam's prohibitions on drinking, with the exception of Murad IV, almost every Ottoman Sultan drunk, and in many cases drunk to excess. They would write poetry, they would talk to the high-level members of the Divan being sort of a legislative council. We'll discuss that a little bit more in depth. And they would really spend time really in Topkapi doing ritualistic ceremonies. At the same time, as more of the aspects of governance were not being handled by these sultans, you began to create a council of military and political affairs. And these became leading individuals. I have a question of whether the sultans were Sufis, because this behavior sounds sort of Sufistic. No, I wouldn't say that they were. I would say that if you're looking for the Sufis, right, that was much in the earlier part of Turkish history, where we were in the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, right, the holy city of Konya. That was really the Sufistic period. At this point, the Ottomans are more standard Muslims. They were writing poetry, but they were more standard. Now, that's not to say that there were no Sufi influences. Sufi influences would be part of the Ottoman Empire until it disintegrates, but they weren't Sufi acolytes in the same way that we would have seen about 100 years ago. All right, so now we have this Council of Military and Political Affairs, and it's made of a bunch of different people who have different duties within the Ottoman state. So you have the Qadi Askar, who are military judges. And there are two Qadi Askar who are on this council. They are responsible for maintaining law and order on the battlefield and administering cases of civilians in areas that are recently conquered. You had the Defterdar, which was the financial advisor. You had Nishancı, which handled more, let's say, religious aspects of state and welfare. You had the Kapudan Pasha, who was the chief admiral of the Ottoman Navy. You had the Beylerbey of Rumelia. We've talked about Rumelia, which is that area of modern Bulgaria and a little bit further west, that was controlled by Turkish feudal lords or Timars. So the Beylerbey, or the Prince of Princes of Rumelia, was the representative of all those Timariotes, all of these owners of Timars, these feudal lords, and the Agha of the Janissaries, or the Prince of the Janissaries. And we've mentioned the Janissaries are the elite infantry corps, primarily made of former Christians who were brought from the Balkans through the process of devshirme, enslaved to the Sultan, converted to Islam, and those who were skilled diplomatically were sent to the diplomatic corps or to governance, and those who were militarily inclined were sent to the Janissaries. So the Agha of the Janissaries represents the will of the Janissaries. And so you can see all these six individuals, the Qadi Askar, the Defterdar, the Nishancı, the Kapudan Pasha, the Beylerbey, and the Agha, all have different areas over which they want control, and they necessarily will have conflicts of interest in terms of guiding the Turkish state. And we mentioned that we would talk about this Divan a little more. The Divan was a much larger council, as opposed to that Council of Military and Political Affairs, which is just the highest level officials. All of these officials are represented in the Divan, but the Divan includes so many other individuals, and these will debate and discuss processes of state. Now, a Divan is a little bit different from a legislative assembly like we might have in the United States, right? The Congress or the Senate, in that the goal of the Divan is to come to one consensus, one resolution. And so the creation of factions is strongly discouraged. Despite that, of course, because of all of this political wrangling, you're necessarily going to have the creation of factions in the Divan. Given that a number of sultans, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more deeply, were not interested in the political machinations of the Divan, it often fell to the Valide Sultan or the Haseki Sultan, these women of the court, to spy on the Divan and advise their husbands on policy. And so you can sort of see that represented in the picture on the right-hand side. You also have the Grand Vizier, who is the ruler of the Divan, and we've talked about him before. This is Sokolu Mehmet Pasha. He was on the battlefield with Selim at the Battle of Konya in 1559. And so he is in charge of running this area, and he and Sokolu Mehmet Pasha always made sure to have good relationships with the Haseki Sultan and the Valide Sultan because of how important it was to maneuver at court. Finally, the last aspect of governance that the Sultan really took under his belt was to be the Caliph, right? The central person of Islam. And so in that way, he had religious authority, but he wasn't making a lot of jurisprudential decisions based on that religious authority. So to sort of give a lay of the land in terms of the sultans we're dealing with, because we're covering a 90-year stretch of time. And previously, the sultans that we've dealt with had incredibly long reigns, right? We talked about Murad II, who ruled for 30 years, Mehmed II, who ruled for 30 years, Bayezid II, who ruled for 31 years, Selim being the exception, who ruled for 8 years, and Suleiman, who ruled for 46 years, right? So we have these sultans who are ruling for extensive periods of time, powerful individuals who are able to control the court, direct the empire. That is not what we're dealing with during this period. We're dealing with 90 years with 9 different sultans. So we've got an average of about 10 years per sultan. Of these sultans, 3 of them, Selim II, Mehmed III, and Ahmed I, didn't even care about running a country. 2 of them were actually insane. They saw dead people. They yelled and screamed. Like when we say insane, we don't mean in a joking way, like they couldn't keep their mind straight. No, they literally thought ghosts were following them. 3 of them came to power as minors, which meant that the Valide Sultan, or the mother of the Sultan, actually ruled instead of them, right? They couldn't actually be a Sultan at the age of 13, which is when Ahmed I became Sultan. Of these, we have Osman II and Murad IV, who, when they came of age, were the only 2 who really showed any kind of coherent thinking. And after Sokolu Mehmet Pasha was assassinated in 1579, we don't have any good Ferhat Pasha. We don't have any good Grand Vizier who follows him. I have a personal question which I'll answer later. There is, I have a question here about whether there's any indication that the psychiatric issues that, for example, Deli Mustafa and Deli Ibrahim suffered, whether those were the result of genetic issues. It may well have been the case, but obviously it's kind of hard to analyze the psychology of dead people, especially dead people from whom we only have third-party sources, all of whom are biased one way or the other. The other thing is that there's a lot of trauma in especially Deli Mustafa's past, which could help explain why he has these kinds of medical delusions. I have another question of, did they keep any journals when they were alive? Not the crazy individuals, right? We have journals from Grand Viziers, we have journals from other individuals at court, but we don't have their own writing on themselves. That's what I mean. It would be interesting to figure out whether or not the genetics would be traceable. I don't know if anybody's actually looked into that, though, so I can't speak to it. So when we get to Selim II, Selim II is buoyed up by his sister Mihrimah. Rustem Pasha was her first husband. Now, Rustem Pasha was killed by Suleiman. Uh, he was suspected of corruption, but Mihrimah was supposed to be married to other individuals, but the marriage was never consummated, and so she died a widow of her first marriage. She was one of the ones primarily responsible for helping Selim come into power, Selim being her brother. I have a question of what historic sources recorded these insane individuals, please. I don't have the names of the Ottoman histories if that's what you're looking for, but no, it's pretty well established in Turkish historiography. And the question is, do they marry within the family? Is that why there are genetic illnesses? No, we've talked about how all of the sultans are born from consorts, and these consorts are stolen women from across Europe. So if anything, they have a huge amount of genetic diversity. There may be something in the original Turkish line, the line of Osman, that could be the problem. But this is not like ancient Egypt where you have an incestuous relationship going on. Mihrimah and Selim never had anything close to intimate relations. And yeah. So anyway, Selim finds this woman in the harem, Nurbanu. Nurbanu was, we actually don't know what she was ethnically. We know that she was taken from Cyprus. She was taken from either Cyprus or Crete, and she could either be Venetian, Greek, or Jewish. And there are different Turkish researchers who opine on all of these. Regardless, what we can say about Nurbanu is that she was incredibly intelligent and strikingly beautiful. And so Selim took a fast attachment to her. Other Europeans who visited the court of Selim II also remarked on how beautiful she is. And it's quite clear that she was a primary decision maker in Selim II's court. While Selim II still did make official decisions, Nurbanu was behind pretty much every major decision he made. I have questions. So were European women kidnapped them? Some of them were kidnapped by pirates, because we've talked about Barbarossa and other members of the Ottoman naval fleet, which were doubly pirates. And some of them were the daughters of Devshirme, right? The tax that was leveled on the Christians of the Balkans. If you were a boy and you were collected by Devshirme, you went into the Janissaries or the diplomatic corps. If you were a girl and taken by Devshirme, you went into the harem. So yes, all of the women that we are talking about today, with the exception of Mihrimah, are women who are slaves. They were born free and captured and brought into slavery. And when we say slave, I mean in the sense of they have no control over their own person, right? They are owned, they can be transferred like property. Now, of course, when you get to this high level inside the government, you can't be transferred so easily, right? Because you have the protection of the Sultan, but it's because you have the protection of the Sultan, not because you have control over your own life. So at this point, Selim also will go to Edirne and stay at his palace in Edirne, and he'll just laze about the palace in Edirne, which of course angers the Janissaries and the Divan, because you can see on this map that it's a 3-hour car ride from Edirne to Istanbul, and you can imagine how difficult that trek would have been in the age of horse and carriage. So it meant that Selim, who had to be consulted officially on numerous matters of state, was far away. And at the same time, him being in Edirne meant that Nurbanu, being the one in Topkapi, was primarily the one responsible for organizing everything. During Selim's time in Edirne, Mimar Sinan builds his magnum opus, which is the Selimiye Jami. You can see it in the background here, and it's very famous for having this sort of black circle next close to the dome. On the inside, you can see it's divided in 8 sections, and it's considered Mimar Sinan's best piece of artwork. So And this is something we're going to address in, I think, 2 sessions when we get to the Russian wars. The Russians are beginning to move further south, right? Because the Russians are based in Moscow, and they're expanding further south. And the Ottomans see this as a potential threat. Now, historically, the Russians have been tributary states of the Khanate of Kazan, which is north of what's now Kazakhstan, and the Khanate of Crimea, which is itself a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans had seen the Russians historically as allies, but as the Russians were getting more and more powerful, the Ottomans wanted to create a natural border between themselves and the Russians. And so they attacked jointly the cities of Azov and Astrakhan. Sokulu Mehmed Pasha was behind the attack on Astrakhan, but the Russians, led by Ivan IV the Terrible, Ivan IV Grozny, attacked Astrakhan at the same time and was able to take the city before the Ottomans could take it. Now, the point of this dual attack was that eventually the Ottomans would create a canal that would connect Azov to Astrakhan and therefore create a water boundary that the Russians would have to respect. But with the Russians now in control of Astrakhan, that was no longer a possibility. And as I said, we'll see more of this on the Russian side when we do the Russian wars. But because of that loss to the Russians, Sokulu Mehmed Pasha was a little bit disgraced, and Selim II was having difficulty justifying to the Janissaries why he should be in power, right? Remember, they're angry that he moved to Edirne. They're angry that Sokulu Mehmed Pasha lost this battle. So he needs a win, and he needs a win badly. And so he decides to provoke a war with Venice. And the way he's going to provoke that war is by taking the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had been the site of pirates, and those pirates were causing problems for shipping, especially between Anatolia and Egypt, right? Egypt, I don't know how many of you remember, is one of the largest bread baskets in the Ottoman Empire at this point. So a lot of what's feeding the people in Constantinople is coming from Egypt. So keeping those supply lines open is crucial. Now, the Venetians had put off an Ottoman conquest of Cyprus by continually paying dues to the Ottoman Empire, about 8,000 ducats a year. But by 1570, with Selim needing this win, he consulted with Sheikh al-Islam, Abu Sa'd Effendi, and the Sheikh al-Islam is the key Islamic leader. We discussed last time how power was divided between the Sultan in secular issues and the Sheikh al-Islam in religious issues. And Abu Sa'd Effendi was able to give a fatwa or a religious decree that the Christians on Cyprus were destroying mosques, and therefore the Muslim population on Cyprus was in danger, which would justify, religiously speaking, an invasion of Cyprus. And so you can see the Ottoman fleet. The Ottoman fleet mustered and landed at an area near Larnaca. You can see on that map where you see that ship sort of pulling into port on the southeast side of the map of Cyprus. That's that port of Larnaca where the ships disengaged. And the Venetians were unable to rally their own navy quickly enough to prevent a massive disembarkation of the Ottoman forces on the island. The Ottoman forces then surrounded Nicosia, which was the capital of Cyprus. And you can see here that Nicosia had these angular protuberances all around its fortress. And those fortress walls, you can see a picture of them on the upper right-hand side, are incredibly high. So all of those protuberances are protected by those high walls, which were incredibly defensible. It was the most recent in Renaissance technology. The reason that they are these sort of angular shape is specifically because it's difficult to get cannons close enough to the entry points, which are between the protuberances, in order to fire on them effectively. And the differing shape allows the cannonballs to glance. That said, Nicosia was not well defended in terms of its personnel and their allocation. And so the Ottomans were able to break the siege in about 2 months, about a month and a half, 2 months, in 1570. And once Nicosia fell, all of the rest of the cities of Cyprus surrendered, with one exception, which is the city of Famagusta. which is currently controlled by the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus under the name Famagusta. But so if you're looking on the map, it's not called Famagusta anymore. But when the Turkish military besieged this city, the defense was laid by this Marco Antonio Brigadin, a Venetian commander who was incredibly resourceful. Despite being overwhelmed in terms of manpower, he fought down to the last musket ball that he could put in his arquebus, right? Every wave of Ottoman forces that attacked were destroyed. He took more casualties on the Ottoman side than he had men in his own division. That said, he could not hold off the Ottomans for forever, and so he finally made terms of surrender when he noticed that the Ottoman sappers were digging under the wall and would breach very soon. And the Ottomans were willing to make peace, and they signed a document permitting all of the Greek citizens to stay. They could leave any period within 2 years. The Venetians could go freely, but they needed to leave. And so the evacuation began. 4 days into this, it comes to the attention, whether or not this is accurate or not is a subject of historical debate, that the Muslim prisoners in the Venetians' possession had been abused and some of them killed. Upon hearing this and seeing how many Turkish soldiers had died in the actual fighting, Marco Antonio Brigadin was tortured. And the way he was tortured is that he was whipped until the skin actually came off of his body. And his actual skin was kept as a treasure prize in Constantinople after he died from this kind of excessive abuse. The Venetians, about 10 years later, actually ran a secret operation to steal the skin and bring it back as a hero for burial in Venice. But the Ottomans were able to take Cyprus, and this pushed the conflict further to the west. The Ottoman navy was gathering in Lepanto, which you can see in the map is between the Peloponnesos and mainland Greece. And there's a difficulty in terms of Lepanto because it took a while for the Spaniards and the Venetians to actually agree to join forces together along with the Genoese, all three of these groups generally hating each other, but they agreed to create a holy league of Catholics who would oppose Ottoman expansion. And the forces that actually met at Lepanto were roughly equally matched. The Ottomans had slightly more ships. The European ships were slightly better built. Both of them had crews of above 30,000 individuals. I think on the Christian side, you had about 40,000. On the Ottoman side, you had about 50,000. So this on paper should look like an even battle. In terms of what actually happened, it was a crushing victory for the Europeans at the Battle of Lepanto. And it really stopped Ottoman naval expansion beyond this point. Now, it didn't stop Ottoman naval expansion because the ships were destroyed. In fact, almost all the ships that were destroyed at Lepanto were effectively rebuilt within 2 or 3 years. The reason it stopped Ottoman expansion is that 30,000 Ottoman sailors died in this battle, and these were some of the most gifted admirals in the Ottoman Navy, which meant that, given the current strategic situation with the Knights controlling Malta and the Venetians still having Crete, it meant that the Ottomans would no longer be able to expand as effectively, and it would mean that the North African provinces would be much more accessible to the Europeans at sea. On the European side, it was Don Juan of Austria who led the European fleet to victory. And from the European side, the Battle of Lepanto, despite being a success against the Ottomans, did not lead to any large-scale Holy League enduring after the battle. So the Christians were not able to capitalize on their gains. It basically meant that the Ottomans could no longer grow, but the Christians didn't have any growth potential either. So another story I want to tell is the story of Giovanni Dioniga Galeni. You can see him on the upper left-hand side. This is an Italian man. He comes from Le Castella. You can see it on the map. It's at the southern part of Sicily. And he was abducted, as many Christians were along the Mediterranean, by pirates. This one was a sub-commander under Hayreddin Barbarossa. And he started as an oarsman. We saw last time that in the Ottoman ships, you have large numbers of oars that stick out at the sides, and you have oarsmen who are underneath who are pulling those oars. That's not to say that these ships don't also have sails, but the sails are good for long distance movement, and the oarsmen are for greater maneuverability during battle. And working as an oarsman is incredibly difficult, but this man Giovanni demonstrated that he was more than capable, and he eventually made his way topside, where he started becoming at first a commander and later an admiral in his own right. And when he became an admiral in his own right, he took on the name Uluç Ali Reis. In fact, he has 4 or 5 names across his life, but I'm going to use Uluç Ali Reis to refer to him for the rest of the time. So Uluç Ali Reis served first under the command of Turgut Pasha, who was one of the chief admirals in the Ottoman fleet. He was killed during the siege of Malta in 1565. But before that, in 1560, Uluç Reis had been under Turgut's command when the Spanish fleet met them at Djerba, which is an island just off the southern Tunisian coast. And this was an incredible victory for the Ottomans, and resulted in over 10,000 Spanish casualties. And so there's a myth, we don't know whether it's true or not, because this area was destroyed during the French occupation. But apparently there was a tower of skulls, and you can see sort of a drawing of what that looked like. And these were all skulls of Spaniards that had been collected during the battle as sort of a symbol of Ottoman dominance in the southern part of the Mediterranean. During the Battle of Lepanto, Uluç Reis was one of the only Ottoman admirals who was able to get his fleet out relatively unscathed from the conflict. And because of this, he was able to also destroy a Maltese ship and bring the flag of the sovereign state of Malta, of the Hospitaliers, to Selim II in 1571. Upon bringing this flag to Selim, he was named Kılıç, meaning the sword, because he had cut down the flag. And he was assigned control of Algeria. But he would always remain from this point until he died, Kabudan Pasha. He would be the chief admiral of the Ottoman fleet. So he died in 1587. So while all this is going on in the Mediterranean, he's also involved in North Africa. So he becomes the Beylerbey, the chief, the prince of princes of Algeria, in the mid 1560s, while also serving in the navy. So he sort of like jumps on sea, off sea, on sea, off sea. And while he's in Algeria in 1569, he marches Ottoman troops on Tunis. Right, we've mentioned before that Tunis is ruled by the Hafsid dynasty, which is a Muslim dynasty, but they are a vassal state of Spain. And so when Uluç Ali Reis marches his 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers on Tunis, this leads to Abu al-Abbas Ahmed III, the Hafsid Caliph, abandoning the city and moving to La Golette. La Golette, you can see on the map of the Spanish invasion, is this small fortress in the red circle at the edge of the sea, with Tunis being further inland. And you can see a picture of La Golette as it exists today down below. After the Battle of Lepanto, Don Juan of Austria takes his Spanish contingent and decides to move against Uluç Ali Reis by amassing that Spanish fleet and bringing Tunis back into Spanish power in 1573. In 1574, Uluç Ali Reis has another land invasion of Tunisia, and the Spaniards are not able to hold it. Abu al-Abbas Ahmed III's brother, who was put in power, is not able to resist the Ottomans, and Tunisia falls to the Ottomans. It becomes an eyalet, or a province of the Ottoman Empire, and it will remain a province of the Ottoman Empire until 1881, when it becomes conquered by the French. And so now we get to the reign of Murad III. Now, Murad III is the son of Nurbanu Sultan. Remember her, she was the extremely attractive and intelligent wife of Selim II. And when Murad dies, Nurbanu actually hides him in the harem and puts him in a frozen box with lots of ice to prevent anybody from discovering that Selim II had died. Because one of the things that we have to remember, right, is that when any sultan dies, there's a race from all of the children to come to Constantinople, and the first one to get to Constantinople to the divan becomes the new sultan. So the fact that Selim died meant that all the sons that he had produced through all of his consorts would be making their way to Constantinople. And Nurbanu did not want that. She wanted Murad to inherit. So, as I said, she froze his body for 12 days until Murad III could get himself to Constantinople. The only other person she told was Suleiman Mehmet Pasha, right, that Grand Vizier. And he came, and as soon as he declared himself Sultan, he issued the orders for 19 executions of all of his brothers who could stand to raise a claim against him. Now, Murad was not terribly interested in actually ruling. In fact, he was one of the first sultans to grow up in the kafes. You can see the kafes in the center, which means the cage. This was where all of the where young sultans would stay in order to prevent them from causing possible rebellion in the empire. Now, remember, this is completely different than the original system where the consorts would go out to the provinces and basically raise their children on being a governor. The valide would become valide Şehzade, mothers of princes, and would rule different regions of the empire. Now, a lot of the princes are in this kafes with minimal exposure outside the palace. They're not really interested in the political affairs of state, and that's especially the case for Murad III. I have a question of whether this was like the same for the pharaohs of Egypt. The pharaohs of Egypt didn't often leave their palaces, but they did go on military campaigns. So I would say it's different, and I also would say that ancient Egypt existed for 4,000 years, more or less. No, sorry, 3,000 years. So there's a lot of different ways that ancient Egypt was run. But so you have this golden cage that he grew up in, and so it meant that he wasn't terribly interested in ruling. Nurbanu Sultan, however, was very much interested in ruling, and so until she died in 1583, she was effectively the sultan in all but name. She frequently met with Sokulu Mehmet Pasha, the Grand Vizier. She would listen behind the curtain of the divan, because, of course, as a woman, she was not allowed to partake in the divan, but she understood who the power players were. She understood what the arguments were, and it was her who would tell Murad, her son, what to do and how to do it. And in order to keep him preoccupied, she would manage the harem very effectively and try to find as many women as she could to sexually please her son, and thinking that as long as he was thinking with his lower head, he wasn't thinking with his upper head. Murad III finally found a woman that he fell madly in love with. This is Safiye Sultan. And Safiye became his wife, and there became a personality conflict between Nurbanu and Safiye to a certain degree, because Safiye made it so that Murad did not want to be with other women, which made her job a little bit harder. in terms of controlling him. Nevertheless, she was actually a very effective stateswoman, and was partially behind the successes in the Ottoman-Persian War that we're going to discuss in a few minutes. Now, at the same time, she was connected to a number of different economic functions in the empire. And one of those was through a Jewish woman by the name of Esther Handarlı, who is based on the Greek island of Naxos. Naxos was under Ottoman control, but today it's a Greek island. And Esther Handarlı had connections with the vizier of the area, which was Joseph Nasi, who was also Jewish. Joseph Nasi had a number of different economic investments throughout mainland Europe, and he was able to cultivate Nurbanu Sultan's wealth into investing in all of these different developments going on throughout Europe. I have a question. Could the women do any activities such as reading, arts and crafts, music, so they didn't get bored in the harem? Yeah, of course. It wasn't just sit around and look pretty. That being in the harem was, they received education. They were supposed to be people that could speak with the Sultan. Now, at the same time, petitioners would come to Murad from other areas of the empire seeking power. One of these was Abd al-Malik, who was one of the Saadian rulers. If we remember, the Saadians were the kings of Morocco, and they had kicked the Ottoman Empire out when the Ottomans had supported the rival dynasty, the Wattasids. Now, somebody asked if the consorts were similar to courtesans. I would say yes, they're similar to courtesans, but they're courtesans for the Sultan, or for a specific prince. They're not courtesans that can generally be rented out by nobles. But back on Abd al-Malik. So Abd al-Malik was the current king of the Sassanids, and he was willing, in order for help from the Ottoman Empire, to pledge vassalage to the Ottoman Empire, which was a huge surprise. But it was something that Murad III accepted. His successor, Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur, who's the man in the picture here, renounced that vassalage effectively 10 to 15 years later. But at that time, and for the only time, Morocco was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the war of 1578 to 1590 against the Persians was a massive Ottoman victory. Now, if we remember from our Safavid discussion, this was a time when you had massive disruption within the Persian Empire. Shah Tahmasp had just died in 1576. Between 1576 and the accession of Shah Abbas the Great in 1590, there was an incredible amount of instability under the Shahs Ismail II and Muhammad Khudamandeh. So because of that, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity, especially Mehmet Pasha Sokolovich saw this possibility, and so did Nurbanu. And so they agitated for war against the Persians to take advantage of the instability. This was further compounded by the fact that in the east, the Khanate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva, two what we would call Uzbek states today, were also agitating for war against the Persians, and this would bring a war against Persia on two fronts. At the same time, the Crimeans were a primary ally of the Ottomans, right? They were a vassal state, and so Ghazi II Giray, who was the king of Crimea, sent his brother Adil Giray into the war. The war was an astounding success for the Ottomans. You can see on this map all of the area that is in yellow or hashed in pink on the Persian side. All of that territory was conquered in this war against the Persians. And this was very surprising to many of the Caucasus peoples, like the Georgians, the Georgians and the people of Shirvan, because these groups had traditionally been Persian vassal states, and in fact, during the war, on several occasions, they tried to switch to being Persian vassal states. Now, the reason this war was such an effective victory was not in particular because of Mehmet Pasha Sokolovich. He died in 1579. He was assassinated, actually, because of court politics. But it was successful because one of the leading Persian commanders, Mirza Salman Jabiri, was assassinated himself in 1583 because of court intrigue on the Persian side. And even though the Crimean prince Adil Girey was taken prisoner, he was eventually released, and that didn't hamper the Crimean War contribution. This war is particularly devastating on the Safavid side, we discussed, because the homeland of the Safavid Shahs is in that area of Iranian Azerbaijan near the city of Tabriz, and so this was the loss of their ancestral homeland, the Safavid homeland. Now, during this period, especially starting in the 1590s and continuing until the 1670s, we'll have a number of small-scale revolts among Turks in eastern Anatolia. And these Turks have been conscripted into the army as gunmen, or sekban. We've talked about how the Janissaries are the elite infantry, and now they're beginning to be equipped with arquebuses and muskets. But there are more soldiers that are necessary than can be recruited from the Janissary Corps, people with less experience. And so these Turkish tribes are brought in as sekban. But from time to time, the leaders of these sekban want something that is not on the menu, for want of a better term. They want either a governorship, or they want a military title, or they want some sort of recognition of their power and prowess. So they revolt. And so you have different sekban, you have different groups that are revolting at different times, especially in eastern Turkey, but also in Romania. And these groups are called Jalali revolts altogether. Oftentimes, the Valide Sultan or the Hasaki Sultan will reach into her purse and pay off the leaders of these revolts, and they'll calm down. We actually mentioned these Jalali revolts when we were talking about the Armenians, because in a lot of cases, they occurred in areas where Armenians were a significant minority, if not the majority of the local population. And so they got killed in the crossfire when all these gunmen started taking hostages and killing people in order to get the attention of the Ottoman Sultan. I have a question about the map. When we're looking at this map, the way that Azerbaijan of today is labeled on this map is as Shirvan, which was the Iranic kingdom in that area, and that area is almost always known as Shiran or Albania until the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, when it's renamed by the Russians as Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijan on this map is the Iranian province of Azerbaijan, which had held that name for at least 2 millennia before this point. And it still does. If you go to Iran, that is called the Ostan of Azerbaijan. Okay. So those are the Jalali revolts. Now, I feel like we're talking about a lot of places, but we don't really have sort of a map in mind. So I want to sort of show what the map looks like. The Ottoman Empire has pushed about as far north into Europe as it will ever go, but that is still a significant amount. You can see the Habsburg Austria next to it. And despite its small size, Habsburg Austria indirectly has control of the Holy Roman Empire. So that area of what's now Germany is somehow connected to the Austrian Empire, and so it's not as weak as it would look by its size. To the due north is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We also see that the Russian Tsardom has expanded, and because of the defeat of the Khanate of Kazan by Ivan the Terrible, you can see that Tsardom now reaches all the way into what's now Kazakhstan, and shares a border with the Ottoman Empire in Shirvan. Okay, So the Austrians and the Ottomans get into war from 1591 until 1606. It's called the Long Turkish War, or the 13 Years' War. For those of you who are doing very quick math, you'll realize that that is not 13 years, that is 15 years. Um, and that's because the Ottomans count the conquest of Bihać in 1591, which the Austrians don't count, so they start counting in 1593. This war really is much more about internal politics in the Ottoman Empire than it is anything about the Austrian, the actual war with the Austrians. Now, there are victories on the Ottoman side, there are victories on the Austrian side. The peace that ends up being signed is basically a status quo antebellum kind of peace where nothing has changed. But in terms of the internal politics of the Ottoman Empire, you now have two Grand Viziers or Ferhat Pashas. You have Serdar Ferhat Pasha and you have Koca Sinan Pasha. Both of these men are Albanian ethnically. They were brought into the Ottoman Empire through the devshirme system, right? They were collected as young boys and brought up as slave soldiers. Koca Sinan Pasha had actually ruled for a time in Damascus as well as a governor, and so they had different trainings throughout different parts of the empire. But you can imagine their rivalry very similar to the Disraeli Goldstone rivalry, if you're familiar with that from British politics, where one would be in power and then they would lose to the other one, and then the other one would be in power, and then the first one would be in power, and then and it would just keep going back and forth. So they had 4 or 5 different tenures, but they kept flipping to the other one. You can see there Koca Sinan Pasha burning the relics of Saint Sava. This was an attack on the Serbian people because the Serbians were rebelling during the middle of this war in 1594. And the flag that they used was with a symbol of Saint Sava, who was a respected saint among the Serbian Orthodox Church. So Koca Sinan Pasha ordered the relics to be brought up out of the ground and burnt as a symbol that they would burn any and all resistance to their authority. During the war, Mehmed III was the new sultan. He was the son of Murad III. And Mehmed III was probably the least qualified person to be sultan, who's not actually crazy. So we have all kinds of funny stories about him. You can see him there at the surrender of Eger in 1596. Eger was finally, the Hungarian forces at Eger were finally defeated. This is in contrast to what happened about 50 years earlier when they withstood the siege. Now they fell. But in the Battle of Kerestesh, which you can see on the left-hand side, which the Turks called Hachova, in 1596, Mehmed III actually didn't want to go into battle, and he ordered his leading commanders to abandon the attack. They didn't listen to him. And then in the middle of the battle, he wanted to walk off the battlefield. And his commanders literally had to pay him to stay on the battlefield for the entirety of the battle, which, by the way, the Ottomans won. Afterwards, he was so excited by the victory that he returned to Istanbul, and he made the commander in the Battle of Kerestesh into the new Grand Vizier. And for the first time in history, Serdar Ferhat Pasha and Koca Sinan Pasha agreed on something. This guy would not be the Grand Vizier. So he lost the job in about 40 days. And Mehmed III decided he wanted to go campaigning again. And the surgeon said in the politest way possible, "You are too fat to leave the palace." The way he said it was that due to heavy intoxication and a largesse of size, it is not advisable for the Sultan to leave the palace. So Mehmed III was succeeded by his son, Ahmed I. And during the reign of Mehmed III and Ahmed I, the woman really in power was Safiye Sultan, right? Safiye was the wife of Murad III. So she is Sultan Ahmed's grandmother. And during his reign, he marries a woman named Kösem. We're going to talk a little bit about Kösem in a bit. And Kösem and Safiye convince him to not murder his brother, Mustafa. Ahmed was 13 at the time, Mustafa was 12. And this was the first time that fratricide did not occur upon succession of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Ahmed I didn't care about being Sultan at all. He was not interested in the affairs of state. He was a very pious Sultan. He prayed 5 times a day and is responsible for the construction of Sultan Ahmed Jami, or the Blue Mosque. You can see it in the lower right-hand side, which is probably Istanbul's most famous attraction. He was also completely unconnected to the peace treaty that was signed to end the Long Turkish War, or the 13 Years' War at Şehzades, which is on the border between Slovakia and Hungary. It's on the Slovak side. And that treaty basically restored the status quo antebellum. Safiye Sultan was the one who was primarily responsible for getting that treaty signed in the court, along with the Pasha. The Grand Vizier. Now, this is the inside of Sultan Ahmed Jami. So you can sort of see this masterpiece. Of course, it was not built by Mimar Sinan. He was dead by this point, but it was built by one of his proteges. And you can see it has a lot of the same sort of stylistic elements as we could see in the mosques that we looked at last week. And so now we see Kösem. There's a very famous picture of her suckling Mustafa. Suckling her son Murad. But I think that this picture really, because she was also known for being incredibly beautiful. She was the daughter of a Greek Orthodox priest. And similarly to the other, she was captured, put in the harem. But she was, for want of a better term, in and out of power from 1605 to 1651. And you can see all the different sultans that were in power. Your eyes are not deceiving you. Mustafa I was in power, removed, put back in power, and removed again, which is why he's there twice. She was responsible for several of these accessions, and if not the accession, for a coup to try and install one of these sultans. Mustafa I, as I said, was spared by Ahmed I. Ahmed I died when he was only 27. So Mustafa took power, and pretty much everybody agreed that he was crazy. He kept wandering around the castle looking for Ahmed, even though Ahmed was dead, and he had been shown the corpse. He was ranting and raving. Kösem thought that she could control him, so she wanted him in power. But she eventually gave up and allowed Osman II, who was one of her sons, who was her stepson, to take power. I have a question. The tradition of ritualized fratricide seems unusually barbaric. I would say that yes, it's certainly barbaric, but you have to understand what the problem of leaving one of these sultans alive is that he could raise, if you leave a prince alive, that prince could go into the countryside, recruit janissaries, could start a rebellion. So killing the brother early prevents that full-scale rebellion, and in fact saves lives. That's the thought process. I'm not agreeing with it, but it's simply that was the logistics. So now Osman II acceded to the throne in 1618. We're going to discuss him a little bit later, but suffice to say, he's not in power for very long. And in order to retain power, Kösem Sultan puts Mustafa I back on the throne, and he is on the throne for about a year until her son Murad IV is put on the throne. Now, Murad IV is a young child when he becomes sultan, and so Kösem is effectively his regent until he comes of age. She then tries to put Ibrahim in power, and Ibrahim is also relatively crazy. And she tries to launch a coup to replace him with Mehmet IV, despite not having a good connection with Mehmet IV. In 1647, that coup fails, but Mehmet IV comes to power anyway in 1648 when the Janissaries lock Ibrahim up and then later kill him. And in 1651, she tries to replace Mehmet IV with her son, her next son, Suleiman II. And that coup fails. And because that coup fails, Mehmet IV's Haseki Sultan, Turhan, has Kösem executed. So she dies in 1651, killed by the Haseki Sultan at the time. The picture of Kösem, I have a question about that. This is, again, from Muhteşem Yüzyıl, the Magnificent Century. There are like 200 or so episodes. It's not Shannon Doherty. It's a Turkish actress. And there are like 200 episodes. And so they get to almost all 100 years of the Ottoman Sultanate. Of the Sultanate of Women period in the Ottoman Sultanate. All right. So back to this map. At this point, I sort of wanted to focus on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth because that's sort of the focus of Ismail II's reign. And so Ismail II is contesting with the Polish government control of Moldavia. Now you can see on this map, Moldavia, sorry, 1 second. Moldavia is this region right here. I did it a little big, but you can sort of, it's on the Ottoman side of this circle. And it had been a territory that had been an Ottoman vassal state for over 100 years at this point. And the Polish government was seeking to expand. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was seeking to expand into the area. And so they launched a war in order to take that area. Now, the Ottomans had some initial victories. Osman II led his soldiers into battle at the Battle of Tsatsora. You can see this is a painting of the Crimean Tatars, who were, of course, Mongol vassals, who also fought in the Battle of Tsatsora. And this was a defeat for the Poles, who retreated to the city of Khotyn. And the Battle of Khotyn took place where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was led by Jan Karol Chodkiewicz. And he was able to create strong enough fortifications and align the Polish cavalry well enough to withstand the Ottoman attack. And the Battle of Khotyn was a Polish-Lithuanian success. The war didn't effectively change much in the way of borders, but it clarified that Moldavia would remain in the Ottoman sphere of influence as a vassal state. Osman II blamed the Janissaries for some of his losses, and he also blamed them for trying to promote corruption in the court. In comparison to his predecessor, right, Deli Mustafa, Insane Mustafa, and Ahmed I, who was not interested in the affairs of state, Osman II was very much interested in the affairs of state. And so the fact that the Janissaries were opening up coffee shops and taking a profit, and were increasingly using that money to corrupt the state, offended him, and so he started to try and make reforms against the Janissaries. The Janissaries, however, in 1622 decided that they were not going to surrender their power, and so they found Osman II, bound him, gagged him, and garroted him. I have a question about the arms of the Polish and the Ottomans. The Ottoman technology was slightly more advanced than the Polish technology, but as a general matter, yes, they both had access to artillery, to arquebuses, to and early muskets. The reason for the Polish victory at Khotyn really has to do with the structural defenses. The wall at Khotyn was very strong, and the Ottomans couldn't take it down. The other thing is that Khotyn is a much colder city than a lot of the cities that the Ottomans were used to fighting in, and so that weighed heavily on a lot of their troops. All right. Under Shah Abbas of the Safavid Empire, the Safavids moved to reconquer the territory that had been taken in the war of 1578 to 1590. And the Persians were particularly brutal in the way that they took these territories back. You can see when they took back the city of Tabriz in Iranian Azerbaijan, they cut off the heads of the Ottoman soldiers and paraded them around. Of course, the fact that this happened during the reign of Ahmed I, who was not terribly concerned with this, meant that the Ottomans were on the back foot, and it would require all of the pashas working together, all of these different leading individuals who all wanted to be Grand Vizier, working together in order to hold off the Persians, and they were not generally successful. Shah Abbas was able to conquer all of the Caucasus back, with the exception of the westernmost parts of Georgia, the areas of Colchis, and he also won back Iraq, which had been under Ottoman control since Suleiman had taken it in 1534. It wasn't until Delhi Mustafa was removed and Murad was old enough in 1635 that he could begin a major counterattack. And so he marched, and this was the first march since Osman II in 1621, right? That march to Poland. This was the first march since then. So it's been 14 years since an Ottoman Sultan has led his troops in battle. But Murad IV marches from the eastern bank of the Bosphorus, the city of Üsküdar, which is now part of the Istanbul metropolitan area, through his empire to the city of Revan, modern Yerevan, to the city of Khoy and the city of Tabriz, and he puts them all under siege, many successful victories. And this puts Shah Abbas, who had just conquered all of this territory, on the back foot. Now, Murad IV is not able to consolidate his gains east of Yerevan because it's just too long of a supply line. The Ottomans can't maintain that. But after sacking Tabriz, he returns to Yerevan and then makes his way slowly back to Istanbul, having forced the Safavids to retreat back to the historical borders that the two states had, with the exception of Iraq. Yes, Karadeniz is the Black Sea in Turkish. Somebody's asking if that's the case. And Kara just means black, Deniz is sea. And so it's a literal translation, but there are other seas, like for example, the Mediterranean is Akdeniz, which is the wide sea. So it's not a literal translation. During this time, actually, if you're interested in the language, it was also called Siyah Deniz, because Siyah was the Persian word for black, and at that point in time, Ottoman Turkish had a lot of Persian loanwords, so it was called both Siyah Deniz and Karadeniz. But today, no Turk will call it Siyah Deniz because the language has been modified. All right. The other major victory of Murad was the siege of Baghdad. Now, originally Baghdad had been under Ottoman control. The Persians took it actually through finances more than through battle. The governor of Baghdad had basically asked for more money from the Ottomans. He didn't get it. He asked for more money from the Persians. The Persians gave it to him, so he surrendered the city right to them. The Ottoman forces tried several times to take the city, but it wasn't until Murad IV stepped onto the battlefield that he was able to besiege the city and take it down in 39 days. The reason for this is that he was more ambitious than most of his grand viziers had been. And in fact, despite them telling him not to try and breach on the 39th day, he did. And he was able to breach the wall and take the city. From this point onwards, Baghdad is a part of the Ottoman Empire until it's taken by Britain in 1917 as part of World War I. And you can see the heroics of Murad IV and Baghdad are still celebrated in Turkey. On the right-hand side is some modern Turkish art celebrating Sultan Murad overwhelming the Safavid forces arrayed against him in the city. And so after Murad IV, who was the last capable sultan, as we mentioned, we had Deli Ibrahim, who was, as I said, another crazy one. And in 1648, he is replaced. Basically, everybody at court agrees that they can't parade him around any longer. The empire needs somebody intelligent at the helm. And so Kösem is willing to accept, at least for the time being, Mehmed IV coming to power. Of course, as I said, in 1651, she tries to overthrow him for her son, who she can more effectively control. And the coup is found out, and she is executed. But Mehmed IV, despite being a very average ruler, makes one very smart decision, which is that he hires Mehmed Köprülü to be his grand vizier. And this is the first grand vizier who's able to consolidate power in the court and prevent this power struggle that had been going on throughout the Sultanate of Women, and create a unified Ottoman government under his rule, which we're going to talk about next time. So, any additional questions? I had a question that was about me, and whether I'm related to David Sassoon. I am related to David Sassoon. I'm a direct ancestor of his brother. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think. I have a question here. How does current Turkish popular culture view these women? I would say that, first of all, it depends on the woman, right? Some of the women that I didn't talk about, like Halime Sultan or Handan Sultan, have a sort of a better image in terms of positive, negative, because they weren't as influential in the court in the long term. And that's also why I didn't include them in the presentation in any meaningful way. But they're less well known. Nurbanu, Kösem, and Mihrimah, and Safiye Sultan, these four women are much more famous, and generally opinion on them is relatively positive. Nurbanu and Kösem are seen as a little bit devious for exactly the reasons I've outlined. But generally these are seen as powerful women, especially considering that there's a strong feminist movement in modern Turkey. These kinds of women are shown as historical examples of women in places of power, who were able to use that power to effectively govern and rule in their own right. I have several thank you comments. There's a comment of, when I was in Zanzibar, they mentioned there are East African slaves captured and brought in so as well. Those would be the Zenj. That is absolutely correct. That's actually where Zanzibar gets its name from. Zanzibar was the Persian name for the Black People Island. So I talked a lot about the Zenj and the Zenj revolts in some of the earlier lectures in this series. I want to say lectures 6 and 7. because that trade happened a lot earlier in history. But to sum it all up, there was a large flow of African slaves, especially to Iraq, because Iraq had large cotton plantations, and those plantations erupted in revolts in the late 800s because of both the Zenj and other minority groups that existed in the area, like the Khawarij, which is a religious minority of Muslims. And so you have the Zenj in that situation, and they continue to be traded, especially to Oman as the years go on, because Zanzibar comes under under Omani control. So, but the Ottomans didn't really traffic in Zenj. They trafficked in it to a bit, but not very much. Yeah, Zanzibar, yeah. There are several other questions about my family. I'm not involved in the book that's being written about the Sassoons. I and my as I said, my connection to David Sassoon is my direct ancestor is his brother. So that was before he left. David Sassoon was born in Iraq. He moved to India. So to the extent that David Sassoon went from India to Shanghai, his descendants went from India to Shanghai or India to London. That happened after they had already separated from my side of the family. I do have family in London, but the Sassoons in London are fifth cousins or sixth cousins, depending on how that math works. I have a question. Were there permanent power centers that we would call deep state beneath and behind all the bloody power struggles? Yes and no. I would say that when we talk about deep state in the United States, we're talking about some sort of organizational infrastructure as opposed to specific individual discernible humans, right? Like we're talking about the CIA as an institution or the FBI as an institution, that these institutions are the deep state. That was not happening. But what was happening was the leaders of these different groups were acting in their political facility to mobilize these groups in a certain direction. We talked about, for example, when Selim came to power, that the Janissaries literally camped outside of Constantinople to prevent his brother Ahmed from getting to the city before him, right? Because the Janissaries didn't want Ahmed to become Sultan. They wanted Selim to become Sultan. And according to the rules, the first prince that got to Constantinople would become Sultan. So the fact that Ahmed couldn't get through the Janissaries meant that Selim would be Sultan, which is exactly what happened. Selim later executed Ahmed, as we talked about in December. So lecture number 20. So there's no deep state in the sense of like the Janissaries are all working together to achieve an aim, but the leader of the Janissaries might, and the governor of this region might, and the Haseki Sultan and the Valide Sultan and all of these people in their own respective offices are operating as a deep state in that sort of way. So it's a little bit like that. Yeah, so I think that seems to cover all of the questions. I'm really excited that so many people are interested and happy to see these presentations. And so I guess we'll leave it off here.
Well, Richard, I just want to thank you again. This is me, Zach.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you again. It's an incredible presentation. I guess one question I have, maybe, quickly, how did the Turkish or Ottoman, bureaucracy reacted to him marrying, an abundantly Slavic woman? And then how does Yanichars accepted or did not accept that? Because now we're talking about somebody who is probably has moved to become Muslim, and now they see this, you would think of convert. And then we know obviously that she was buried also next to him, right? There's an amazing so to speak burial grounds that he was buried right next to Roxolana, which was built actually quite at the same time, and it was his command to be built. So can
Well,
you? Yeah, go ahead.
sure. The Ottoman army is divided, and we sort of discussed this earlier, but it bears repeating because the Ottoman army is always changing, always developing and growing. The Janissaries themselves are all Slavic as well. Well, Slavic or Greek or whatever, because remember, all the Janissaries are sons of Devshirme. And Devshirme is only being practiced in Southeastern Europe, right? We're not getting, for example, Georgian Devshirme in the Ottoman Empire, right? You have the Kurchi in the Safavid Empire, who are Georgians. But in the Ottoman Empire, all the Janissaries are coming out of Devshirme. So you're getting Greeks, you're getting Yugoslavs, you're getting Bulgarians, you're getting Hungarians, you're getting what we would now call Romanians, you're getting Venetians. And so these are the people that are feeding into the Janissaries. At the same time, as you point out, almost all the harem is coming out of Devshirme as well, or coming out of raids on the European coasts. So it's all the same groups of people. So the Janissaries aren't having any problems from an ethnic, first of all, they're not thinking from an ethnic perspective, but even if they were, they wouldn't have any problem from an ethnic perspective with the harems being mostly white because they were white, right? The Turkish element in terms of ethnic Turks was very minimal in the Ottoman government. This is actually a huge nationalistic piece within modern Turkish identity, that because you'll have this sort of discussion of whether the Ottomans were the true Turkish successors of the Seljuk Sultanate, or was it really the Katamanids? And I would say that the Katamanids were more traditionally Turkish than the Ottomans were. The Ottomans were more European looking in the sense of their attentions were focused on Europe. And the Katamanids were not focused on Europe. They were focused on Konya, right? They were focused on that sort of holy place of Anatolian Turkishness. So there's a very European nature to the Ottoman identity in terms of their leaders and in terms of the harem and the Janissaries. Now, in terms of the rest of the Ottoman army, when we talk about the Sipahi, the light cavalry, the Akinci, the raiders, the Sekben, the irregular musketeers, right? You have the Sipahi, the Akinci, and the Sipahi and the Sekben. These three groups are almost overwhelmingly Turkish ethnically. And that's also part of the reason for these Jalali revolts, is that a number of these groups felt like they were being removed in exchange for the sons of Devshirme, right? All these Slavic people who had been converted to Islam and were now serving either in the Janissary Corps or in the diplomatic corps, right? We talked about, for example, Uluç Ali Reis. Despite having this very Turkish name, Uluç Ali Reis, he was born Italian. His birth name was Giovanni, right? So Hayrettin Barbarossa was a Greek. Targut was Anatolian, but we think his parents were Greek. So you have a number of these different individuals in the Ottoman Empire who are at the highest levels, and almost all of them are not Turkish, ethnically speaking.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. And one last question. So I know in harems, they hired a bunch of eunuchs to guard women. How, I know it's a human nature, obviously, when a sultan has 40 wives, can get to them, sometimes he gets to them. But how afraid was the sultan? Was it very well documented that that's the reason he hired eunuchs to guard women so that there wouldn't be any lost?
Well, no, the thing is that it had to be known that the child of a consort was it was important to know who the father of the child of a consort was, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be legitimate. They would be the son of somebody else, and they would have no right to the Ottoman throne. So it was very important to make sure that the guards of these harems could not possibly be the father. Now, there are two ways you could do that. The first way is to give women weapons, and the second way is to make men impotent and give those men the weapons. Well, it turns out men even without potency are still physically stronger, and this sort of misogynistic situation, that's what they chose. So they chose eunuchs. There was a story about Kösem. I forgot to mention it, but it's worth telling, I guess, in this sort of situation. Each of the princes had their own harem, and so when Murad III was alive, he had his own harem, and his son, who would become Mehmet III, had his own harem. And one day, accidentally, Mehmet III had sex with somebody from Murad III's harem. Um, this was when Mehmet was still a prince. Kösem found out about this, and she found the girl. She slit her throat and buried it. It's believed that Murad didn't know that this happened, but well, yeah, didn't know that this happened. But that's the story. And Mehmet never saw that girl again because she was killed.
I guess one last interesting question. How did it really work with 40 women? I mean, what was the I mean, I understand that, there's got to be an order of the grandiose wife and lower rank, but where do you have time for all of them? You need to also be able to accommodate all of them,
Well, no, you
sexually.
don't. The Sultan sleeps with who he wills. So there are a lot of women in the harem who the Sultan may never sleep with, or maybe he sleeps with once or twice in his life. Um, he's sleeping with the Haseki Sultan probably more than all the other women combined. Um, and the other thing you have to remember is that, with the exception of Osman II and Murad IV, and for a short time Mehmet III, these sultans are not really leaving the palace. So they really have nothing better to do than visit the harem. They do some poetry, they do prayers, they do other sorts of things to keep the day interesting, but they have a lot of time to visit the harem. I have a question of what's up with the white and black eunuchs. Do you want to give a little bit of clarity what you mean by that? Because I'm not sure I understand the question. Yeah. So yeah, so typically the Sultan would have sex with only one woman at a time. It was not common to have multiple sex partners at the same time. So like the idea of an orgy in the harem, like maybe it happened once in a while, but it's not common. The other thing, and if we're going to talk about sexual preferences in the Ottoman Empire, there was a long history of homosexuality within the higher levels of the Ottoman nobility. Um, and in particular, it would be young boys. So it's very similar to pederasty. That would be anally penetrated, and that would be the situation there. There is a question of if the women in the harem were sometimes Jewish, were the Sultan's children ever Jewish? Under Jewish law, I imagine some of them would have been, because there definitely were Jews in the harem. We don't know, with the except Nurbanu may have been Jewish. I don't know of any other Valide Sultan, mothers of sultans, who were Jewish or had the possibility of being Jewish. So I don't know if there's any Ottoman Sultan who under Jewish law would have been Jewish. That said, whatever religion Nurbanu grew up with, right? And Nurbanu is not even her name, right? That was the name that the Ottomans gave her. Just like all these other women, all of their names are names that they were given. That's not their birth name. They were converted to Islam. So at the time, if they would have given birth, they would have been Muslims. Jewish law doesn't recognize conversion out of Judaism, but Islam certainly recognizes conversion out of Judaism. So for all intents and purposes, they were Muslims. Then okay. Yeah, the Icholara. Um, I don't know why there was a distinction given between eunuchs who were of black ancestry and eunuchs of white ancestry. Um, yeah, I just don't know.
Yeah, that's also very fascinating. Yeah, they've mentioned during the tour in Turkey that there were a lot of the eunuchs were actually, from the African continent. Was an interesting fact as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, but Richard, thank you again. This was really amazing. I appreciate, and sorry for coming in and out, but thank you. And then I guess you want to talk about next week, and you already probably did. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
so um next week is um
Turco-Russian wars. Um,
oh, we're already there. No, no, no. Next week
yeah,
is the Caprillo Viziers, right? We
yeah,
mentioned uh that after when Mehmed IV came to power, that he appointed Mehmet Caprillo as his vizier very soon after he came to power. And this Albanian man and some of his family were able to effectively rule the Ottoman state. So we're going to discuss him. We're also going to discuss a little bit about how the Ottoman economy works. Um, and that should get us to the year 1700 or thereabouts.
yeah. And
And
also, Richard has a presentation this week on Sunday as well, 2 o'clock, right, Richard?
yes,
With Lisa. Go ahead.
yeah,
Cover.
we're going to be presenting on the Hyksos, who are the 15th dynasty of ancient Egypt, which puts them at around 1700 BCE. We don't know a lot about them because what was typical in ancient Egypt was to destroy the monuments of defeated groups, and the Hyksos were foreign invaders who were defeated, so most of their monuments were destroyed. That said, we do know a bit about them, and they were Levantine people who came from what's now Syria and Israel and conquered uh, the northern part of Egypt. They brought with them a number of different advances in terms of warfare and organization, and we'll see how the Egyptians managed to repel them, in addition to what their beliefs were and what interests they had. I have a question. So you mentioned there was homosexuality going on in the harem. No, no, no. I wasn't saying that homosexuality was going on in the harem. There was just homosexuality going on. The harem was almost all female. But the next question is, but doesn't Islam not accept homosexuality? Correct. Islam does not. One of the things that we have to always keep in mind, right, when we're talking about this history, is that the idealized view that we see today from many Muslims that point to these powerful Muslim empires and say these were good Muslims, they really don't know the full extent of what they're talking about. Um, they are they and so they may be powerful individuals who happen to have called themselves Muslim, and they were people who prayed, but at the same time, they were doing things that Islam does not approve of. Um, and we have numerous different examples of non-Muslim behavior from these Muslims. Fratricide, which we've talked about, today, is a key feature of Ottoman dynastic work, but killing people is a sin according to Islam. There's really, I mean, in war it's permissible, but in this it's not permissible. So there's a lot of things that are acceptable in these historical empires and sort of go along and are part of the culture that are not Islamically sanctioned. Just like in the Christian world, even when we had pious Christian states, we're talking about maybe 500 years ago, right? You had rulers who were doing things that were non-Christian. The thing is that, of course, we have to be clear that um, when we talk about homosexuality prior to the 1960s, let's say, even in the West, um, the idea of a man and a man wanting to build a house, put a white picket fence around it, and have kids who go to the local school, that is a post 1960s understanding of homosexuality that contextualizes it within what we understand as heterosexuality, in a dominant sense. And right, because before the 1960s and even during that period, it was we're here, we're queer, be used to it. In that being gay was outside of the heteronormative organizational structure. Today, it's not the case. So when we talk about homosexuality in the Ottoman period, we're not talking about two men or two women that are deciding to buy a house together, raise kids. That's not what it is. It's two men who are pleasuring each other, and it's usually intermittent. And there's usually some sort of other relationship that brings these men together. Maybe one is the teacher and the other one is the student. Maybe one is building a building and the other one is one of his laborers. There could be but there was some other employment relationship that brought these two people into contact, and they enjoyed each other's physicality.
Richard, why aren't you a professor? Look, one of your fans had said, why aren't you teaching?
Because it doesn't. I like my job. I'm very happy with my current job. But so there's that. The other reason is that as much as I like this, it doesn't pay the bills. And I think that if I had to do this, if I didn't choose to do this, if I had to do this, I would like it less, right? Because I'd be compelled to do it. So I think that that this being a sort of a side project is a lot more fun for me. Hopefully it's a lot more fun for you. And yeah, I guess that sort of covers it.
One last thing, guys. If you
I'm
could,
I'm a lawyer by training.
Yeah.
So I work in in-house counsel for a bank.
Anything Richard touches, it turns to gold. Really, I just wanted to say that if you guys like, what we're doing here, please support us by joining our YouTube channel. We're looking to get. It's not necessarily, for monetary purpose. We just want to get the word out there. We're about 530, 540 subscribers, and we already have the hours to meet. But we wanted to continue this, and maybe even after COVID goes out, we're thinking of, maybe if people want in the future somehow create a travel group and meet people as well. Some, obviously right now COVID, we have to do a Zoom group, but we used to be in-person group, and we had to turn to this. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, if you like what you heard tonight, as I said at the beginning, this is number 25 in a series, so you can hear 48 more hours of me shouting at a microphone about the Middle East. If this is not your cup of tea, like you like me, but you're not a super fan of the Middle East, not a problem. I've given several lectures on Zach's channel about the European Union. In fact, we're going to have a third one on the functioning of the European Union, not on Sunday, but Sunday following at 2 p.m. There are two lectures on that are there. If that's not your cup of tea, I've got some stuff on the modern Middle East, such as the development of the modern nation state of Israel. And of course, Zach has numerous other presentations on other topics. There are at least 25 presentations on the Roman Empire. There's stuff on European history, medieval history, stuff on, yeah, I think that covers it. There's also random stuff like sports history and wine history. So just check out the channel and see what else we put out there.
Again, thank you, Richard. I appreciate it, and incredible work, and and thank you for always coming up and raising the bar.
Thank you.
Just want to wish everybody a nice evening, and see you hopefully for Richard's presentation on Sunday for Hyksos. We have about, I think, 100 members that wanted to see it, but we always welcome more people. And and that If not, see you next Tuesday. And then the following presentations from European Union or any of the Middle Eastern presentations. Thank you and have a nice evening, guys.
Yeah, thank you. And always, I always keep the comment section open. So that's not unique for this presentation, that's for every presentation. Yeah. Anyway, good night, everybody. Mhm. The gaze. Waned Sultan.